Hey friends. Okay, I wanted to just while I'm sitting here, I just wanted to go ahead and try to chip away at this because we're now halfway done with this book. Okay, so this is part 10. So probably like I thought it was going to have about 20 parts to this book. Now, there it seems to be some really good information in the back of some of the appendices and stuff. So I cannot wait to get to that stuff. I think this is going to start getting better and better the further into it we go. So, anyways, we are in the fourth chapter, and it's about the fall now of the Khazarian Empire. Okay, and we were just talking about how Vladimir, the son of whatever the Russian or the grandson of the Russian that basically conquered Khazaria or whatever, he eventually was. He was converted to Christianity by representatives of Byzantium. So, okay, so it says it was a monumentous, a mon, start all over. Okay, it was a momentous triumph of Byzantine diplomacy. Do I need to get reading glasses now? I have seeing far away glasses. But I swear, I feel like it's getting to where I need reading glasses. Maybe I'll try some when I go to the grocery store. Anyway, okay. It was a momentous triumph of Byzantine diplomacy. Verdansky calls it, quote, one of those abrupt turns which make the study of history so fascinating. And it is interesting to speculate on the possible course of history had the Russian princes adopted either of these faiths, Judaism or Islam, instead of Christianity. The acceptance of one or another of these faiths must necessarily have determined the future cultural and political development of Russia. The acceptance of Islam would have drawn Russia into the circle of Arabian culture, that is, an Asiatic Egyptian culture. The acceptance of Roman Christianity from the Germans would have made Russia a country of Latin or European culture. The acceptance of either Judaism or Orthodox Christianity ensured to Russia cultural independence of both Europe and Asia, end quote. But the Russians needed allies more than they needed independence, and the East Roman Empire, however corrupt, was still a more desirable ally in terms of power, culture, and trade than the crumbling empire of the Khazars. Nor should one underestimate the role played by Byzantine statesmanship in bringing about the decision for which it had worked for more than a century. The Russian Chronicle's naive account of Vladimir's game of procrastination gives us no insight into the diplomatic maneuverings and hard bargaining that must have gone on before they accepted baptism, and thereby, in fact, Byzantine tutelage for himself and his people. Cherson was obviously part of the price, and so was the dynastic marriage to Princess Anna. But the most important part of the deal was the end of the Byzantine-Khazar alliance against the Rus, and its replacement by a Byzantine-Russian alliance against the Khazars. A few years later, in 1016, a combined Byzantine-Russian army invaded Khazaria, defeated its ruler, and, quote, subdued the country, end quote. Yet the cooling off towards the Khazars had already started, as we have seen in Constantine's Porphyrogenitus' day, 50 years before Vladimir's conversion. We remember Constantine's musings on, quote, how war is to be made on Khazaria and by whom, end quote. The passage quoted earlier on continues. If the ruler of Alania does not keep the peace with the Khazars, but considers the friendship of the emperor of the Romans to be of greater value to him, then if the Khazars do not choose to maintain friendship and peace with the emperor, the Alan can do them great harm. He can ambush their roads and attack them when they are off their guard on their route to Sarkal and to the 9 regions, and to Cherson, Black Bulgaria, the Volga Bulgars, is also a position and to make war on the Khazars. Is also in a position to make war on the Khazars. I promise I can read. Anyways, Toynbee, after quoting this passage, makes the following rather touching comment. If this passage in Constantine Porphyrogenitus' manual for the conduct of the East Roman imperial government's foreign relations had ever fallen into the hands of the Khazar Khagan and his ministers, they would have been indignant. They would have pointed out nowadays, because they're out that, I'm sorry, They would have pointed out that nowadays Khazaria was one of the most pacific states in the world, and that if she had been more warlike in her Pacific, like pacifist. I always have in my mind like Pacific Ocean, and then I'm like, do you mean specific? Like, no, Pacific, pacifistic. Okay, in the world, and that if she had been more warlike in her early days, her arms had never been directed against the East Roman Empire. The two powers had, in fact, never been at war with each other, while on the other hand, Khazaria had frequently been at war with the East Roman Empire's enemies, and this to the Empire's signal advantage. Indeed, the Empire may have owed it to the Khazars that she had survived the successive onslaughts of the Sassanid Persian Emperor Khosrau to Parviz and the Muslim Arabs, and thereafter the pressure on the empire of the Arabs' onslaught had been relieved by the vigor of the Khazars' defensive resistance to the Arabs' advance toward the Caucasus. The friendship between Khazaria and the empire had been symbolized and instilled in two marriage alliances between their respective imperial families. What then had been in Constantine's mind when he had been thinking out ways of tormenting Khazaria by inducing their neighbor to fall upon her? The answer to Toynbee's rhetorical question is obviously that the Byzantines were inspired by realpolitik, and that, as already said, theirs was not a sentimental age. Good grief, nor is ours. Nevertheless, it turned out to be a short-sighted policy. To quote Barry once more, the first principle of imperial policy in this quarter of the world was the maintenance of peace with the Khazars. This was the immediate consequence of the geographical position of the Khazar Empire, lying as it did between the Dnieper and the Caucasus. From the 7th century, when Heraclius had sought the help of the Khazars against Persia, to the 10th, in which the power of Idil declined, this was the constant policy of the emperors. It was to the advantage of the empire that the Khagan should exercise an effective control over his barbarian neighbors. Quote, this effective control, end quote, was now to be transferred from the Khazar Khagan to the Rus Khagan, the Prince of Kiev, but it did not work. The Khazars were a Turkish tribe of the steppes, who had been able to cope with wave after wave of Turkish and Arab invaders. They had resisted and subdued the Bulgars, Burtas, Pechenegs, Guz, and so on. The Russians and their Slav subjects were no match for the nomad warriors of the steppes, their mobile strategy, and guerrilla tactics. Y'all, I'm gonna get some glasses, I promise. I don't. Maybe my eyes are tired. I don't know what's going on. The most outstanding Russian epic poem of the period, quote, The Lay of Igor's Host, end quote, describes one of the disastrous campaigns of the Russians against the Guz. Okay. As a result of constant nomad pressure, the centers of Russian power were gradually transferred from the southern steppes to the wooded north, to the principalities of Galicia, Novgorod, and Moscow. The Byzantines had calculated that Kiev would take over the role of Italy as the guardian of Eastern Europe and the center of trade. Instead, Kiev went into rapid decline. It was the end of the first chapter of Russian history, followed by a period of chaos, with a dozen independent principalities waging endless wars against each other. This created a power vacuum into which poured a new wave of conquering nomads, or rather a new offshoot of our old friends, the Guz, whom Ivan Fodlan had found even more abhorrent than the other barbarian tribes which he was obliged to visit. These, quote, pagan and godless foes, end quote, as the chronicle describes them, were called Polovtsi by the Russians, Kumans by the Byzantines, Kun by the Hungarians, Kipchaks by their fellow Turks. They ruled the steppes as far as Hungary from the late 11th to the 13th century, when they, in turn, were swamped by the Mongol invasion. One substantial branch of the Kumans, fleeing from the Mongols, was granted asylum in Hungary in 1241 and merged with the native population. Quote, Kun is still a frequent surname in Hungary. They also fought several wars against the Byzantines, another branch of the Guz. The Seljuks, named after their ruling dynasty, destroyed a huge Byzantine army in the historic Battle of Manzikert. in 1071 and captured the emperor Romanus IV Diogenes. Henceforth, the Byzantines were unable to prevent the Turks from gaining control of most provinces of Asia Minor, the present-day Turkey, which had previously been the heartland of East Roman Empire. One can only speculate whether history would have taken a different course if Byzantium had not abandoned its traditional policy, maintained throughout the 3 previous centuries, of relying on the Khazar stronghold against the Muslim, Turkish, and Viking invaders. Be that as it may, imperial realpolitik turned out to have been not very realistic. All right. Section 7 of Chapter 4, the fall. Okay. I'm talking about the fall now of the Khazarian Empire, if you're with me. All right. During the 2 centuries of Kuman rule, followed by the Mongol invasion, the eastern steppes were once more plunged into the Dark Ages, and the later history of the Khazars is shrouded in even deeper obscurity than their origin. And I don't think that's any friggin' accident, dudes. The references to the Khazar state in its final period of decline are found mainly in Muslim sources, but they are, as we shall see, so ambiguous that almost every name, date, and geographical indication is open to several interpretations. Historians, famished for facts, have nothing left but a few bleached bones to gnaw at, like starving bloodhounds, in the forlorn hope of finding some hidden morsel to sustain them. Because these people completely created themselves in the 2nd century. I mean, millennia. I'm sorry, in the 2nd millennia. Okay. In the light of what has been said before, it appears that the decisive event precipitating the decline of Khazar power was not Sviatoslav's victory, but Vladimir's conversion. How important was, in fact, that victory, which 19th century historians, yet one modern authority, Barthold, called him one of the greatest geographers of all time. Wait, no, that can't be right. Where is the footnote? That's so weird. Bro. The ultimate source of all statements that the Russians destroyed Khazaria in the 10th century is no doubt Ivan Hakel. Okay, wait. No. Okay, there is... I always try to read the footnote, but there's no footnote where this asterisk is down at the bottom, so we're just going to skip it. Which 19th century historians habitually equated with the end of the Khazar state. We remember that the Russian chronicle mentions only the destruction of Sarkal, the fortress, but not the destruction of Idil, the capital. That Idil was indeed sacked and devastated we now know from several Arab sources, which are too insistent to be ignored. But when and by whom it was sacked is by no means clear. Ibn Hakel, the principal source, said it was done by the Rus who, quote, utterly destroyed Khazaran, Samander, and Idil, end quote, apparently believing that Khazaran and Idil were different towns, whereas we know that they were one twin town. And his dating of event differs from the Russian chronicle's dating of the fall of Sarkal, which Ivan Hakel does not mention at all, just as the chronicle does not mention the destruction of Idil. Accordingly, Marquardt suggested that Idil was sacked not by Sviatoslav's Rus, who only got as far as Sarkal, but by some fresh wave of Vikings. To complicate matters a little more, the second Arab source, Ibn Miskawai, says that it was a body of, quote, Turks which descended on Khazaria in the critical year 965. By, quote, Turks, he may have meant the Rus, as Barthold maintained, but it could have also been a marauding horde of Pechenegs. For instance, it seems that we shall never know who destroyed Idil, however long we chew the bones. And how seriously was it destroyed? The principal source, Ibn Hakel, first speaks of the, quote, utter destruction, end quote, of Idil, but then he also says, writing a few years later, that, quote, Khazaran is still the center on which the Rus made their trade converge, end quote. Thus, the phrase, quote, utter destruction, end quote, may have been an exaggeration. This is more likely because he also speaks of the, quote, utter destruction, end quote, of the town of Bulgar, capital of the Bulgars. That one's been killing me. Okay, yet the damage which the Rus caused in Bulgar could not have been too important, as we have coins that were minted there in the year 976 through 77, only about 10 years after Sviatoslav's raid, and In the 13th century, Bulgar was still an important city, as Dunlop put it. The ultimate source of all statements that the Russians destroyed Khazaria in the 10th century is no doubt Ibn Hakel. Ibn Hakel, however, speaks as positively of the destruction of Bulgar on the Middle Volga. It is quite certain that at the time of the Mongol attacks in the 13th century, Bulgar was a flourishing community. Was the ruin of Khazaria also temporary? It obviously was. Khazaran Idil and the towns of the Khazars consisted mostly of tents, wooden dwellings, and, quote, roundhouses, end quote, built of mud, which were easily destroyed and easily rebuilt. Only the royal and public buildings were of brick. Maybe that's why they thought Byzantium was like heaven. The damage done must nevertheless have been serious, for several Arab chroniclers speak of a temporary exodus of the population to the Caspian shore or islands. Thus, Ibn Hakel says the Khazars of Idil fled from the Rus to one of the islands of the, quote, Nafta coast, end quote, which is Baku, but later returned to Idil and Khazaran with the aid of the Muslim Shah of Shirwan. This sounds plausible, since the people of Shirwan had no love for the Rus, who had plundered their shores earlier on. Other Arab chroniclers, Ibn Miskawayh and Muqaddasi, writing later than Ibn Hakel, also speak of an exodus of Khazars and their return with Muslim help. According to Ibn Miskawayh, as a price for his help, they all adopted Islam with the exception of their king. Muqaddasi has, this sounds like Japanese or something. It's Muqaddassi, Muqaddasi. That's what I'd say. Has a different version, which does not refer to the Rus invasion. He only says that the inhabitants of the Khazar town went down to the sea and came back to converted to Islam. The degree of this reliability is indicated by the fact that he describes Bulgar as being closer to the Caspian than Idil, which amounts to placing Glasgow south of London. Yet one modern authority, Barthold, called him, quote, one of the greatest geographers of all time, end quote. So, mixed messaging. In spite of the confused and biased nature of these accounts, which seems all too obvious, there is probably some truth in them. The psychological shock of the invasion, the flight to the sea, and the necessity of buying Muslim help may have led to some deal which gave the Muslim community in Khazaria a greater say in the affairs of state. We remember a similar deal with Marwan 2 centuries earlier, which involved the Kagan himself, but left no mark on Khazar history. According to yet another source, Biruni, who died in 1048, Idil in his time was in ruins, or rather once more in ruins. It was rebuilt again, but henceforth it went under the name of Saxon. Saxon, like Anglo-Saxon? The probability is that Saxon was identical with, or at least at no great distance from, Khazarian Idil, and the name may be the older Saracen revived, end quote. It's not like spelled like Saxon. It's S-A Saxon, S-A-K-S-I-N. Anyway, it figures repeatedly in the chronicles well into the 12th century as, quote, a large town on the Volga, surpassed by none in Turkestan, end quote. And eventually, according to one source, became the victim of inundations. Another century later, the Mongol ruler Batu built his capital on its site. In summing up what the Russian Chronicle and the Arab sources tell us about the catastrophe of 965, we can say that Idil was devastated to an unknown extent by the Rus or some other invaders, but rebuilt more than once, and that the Khazar state emerged from the ordeal considerably weakened. But there can be little doubt that inside its shrunken frontiers, it survived for at least another 200 years, i.e., to the middle of the 12th century, and perhaps, though more doubtfully, until the middle of the 13th. The first non-Arab mentions of Khazaria after the fatal year 965 seems to occur in a travel report by Ibrahim ibn Jacob, the Spanish Jewish ambassador to Otto the Great, who, writing probably in 973, describes the Khazars as still flourishing in this time. Next in chronological order is the account in the Russian Chronicle of Jews from Khazaria arriving in Kiev in 986 in their misfired attempt to convert Vladimir to their faith. As we enter the 11th century, we read first of the already mentioned joint Byzantine-Rus campaign of 1016 against Khazaria, in which the country was once more defeated. The event is reported by a fairly reliable source, the 12th century Byzantine chronicler Cedrenus. A considerable force was apparently needed, for Cedrenus speaks of a Byzantine fleet supported by an army of Russians. The Khazars evidently had the qualities of a jack-in-the-box, derived from their Turkish origin or Mosaic faith, or both. Cedrenus also says that the name of the defeated Khazar leader was Georgius Zul. Georgius is a Christian name. We know from an earlier report that there were Christians as well as Muslims in the Kagan's army. The next mention of the Khazars is a laconic entry in the Russian Chronicle for the year 1023, according to which, quote, Prince Tislav marched against his brother, Prince Yaroslav, with a force of Khazars and Kazogians, end quote. The Kazogians, or Cossacks, were a Caucasian tribe under Khazar rule, and may or may not have been the ancestors of the Cossacks, which I'd say probably so. Where was I? Okay. Now, Tislav was the ruler of the short-lived principality of Mutarakhan, centered on the Khazar town of Tamatarka, now Taman, on the eastern side of the Straits of Kerch. This, as already said, was the only Khazar territory that the Rus occupied after their victory of 965. The Khazars in Tislav's army were thus probably levied from the local population by the Russian prince. 7 years later, AD 1030, a Khazar army is reported to have defeated a Kurdish invading force, killed 10,000 of its men, and captured their equipment. This could be added evidence that the Khazars were still very much alive and kicking, if one could take the report at face value, but it comes from a single 12th century Arab source, Ibn al-Athir, not considered very reliable. Plodding on in our chronology, anxious to pick up what morsels of evidence are left, we come across a curious tale about an obscure Christian saint, Eustratius, around AD 1100. He was apparently a prisoner in Cherson in the Crimea and was ill-treated by his quote Jewish master, end quote, who forced ritual Passover food on him. One need not put much trust in the authenticity of the story. Saint Eustratius is said to have survived 15 days on the cross. The point is that it takes a strong Jewish influence in the town for granted, in Cherson of all places, a town nominally under Christian rule, which the Byzantines tried to deny to the Khazars, which was conquered by Vladimir but reverted later to Byzantium, circa 990. They were still equally powerful in Tenotorakhan. For the year 1079, the Russian Chronicle has an obscure entry, quote, the Khazars of Mutarakhan took Oleg prisoner and shipped him overseas to Tsargrad, which is Constantinople, end quote. That is all. Obviously, the Byzantines were engaged in one of their cloak and dagger intrigues, favoring one Russian prince against his competitors, but we again find that the Khazars must have wielded considerable power in this Russian town if they were able to capture and dispatch a Russian prince. 4 years later, Oleg, having come to terms with the Byzantines, was allowed to return to Mutarakhan, where he, quote, slaughtered the Khazars who had counseled the death of his brother and had plotted against himself, end quote. Oleg's brother Roman had actually been killed by the Kipchak Kumans in the same year as the Khazars captured Oleg. But did they also engineer his brother's murder by the Kumans? Or were they victims of the Byzantines' Machiavellian game of playing off Khazars and Rus against each other? At any rate, we are approaching the end of the 11th century, and they are still very much on the scene. A few years later, sub anno 1106, the Russian Chronicle has another laconic entry, according to which the Polovtsi, i.e. the Kumans, raided the vicinity of Zarets, west of Kiev, and the Russian prince sent a force out to pursue them, under the command of the three generals, Yan Putyata and Ivan the Khazar, end quote. This is the last mention of the Khazars in the Old Russian Chronicle, which stops 10 years later in 1116. But in the second half of the 12th century, two Persian poets, Kakani, circa 1106 through 1190, and the better known Nizami, circa 1141 through 1203, mention their epics a joint Khazar-Rus invasion of Shirwan during their lifetime. Although they indulged in the writing of poetry, they deserve to be taken seriously, as they spent most of their lives as civil servants in the Caucasus and had an intimate knowledge of Caucasian tribes. Kakani speaks of, quote, Dervent Khazars, end quote, Darband being the defile or turnstile between the Caucasus and the Black Sea, through which the Khazars used to raid Georgia in the good old days of the 7th century, before they developed a more sedate style of life. Did they revert towards the end to the unsettled nomad warrior habits of their youth? After, or possibly before, these Persian testimonies, we have the tantalizingly short and grumpy remarks of that famed Jewish traveler, Rabbi Pitakia of Regensburg, quoted earlier on. We remember that he was so huffed by the lack of Talmudic learning among the Khazar Jews of the Crimean region that when he crossed Khazaria proper, he only heard, quote, the wailing of women and the barking of dogs, end quote. Oh yeah, I remember that. Was this merely a hyperbole to express his displeasure, or was he crossing a region devastated by a recent Kuman raid? The date is between 1170 and 1185. The 12th century was drawing to its close, and the Kumans were now omnipresent rulers of the steppes. As we enter the 13th century, the darkness thickens and even our meager sources dry up. But there is at least one reference which comes from an excellent witness. It is the last mention of the Khazars as a nation and is dated between 1245 through 1247. By that time, the Mongols had already swept the Kumans out of Eurasia and established the greatest nomad empire the world had yet seen, extending from Hungary to China. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV sent a mission to Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the western part of the Mongol Empire, to explore the possibilities of an understanding with this new world power, and also no doubt to obtain information about its military strength. Head of this mission was the 60-year-old Franciscan friar Johannes de Plano Carpini. He was a contemporary and disciple of St. Francis of Assisi, but also an experienced traveler and church diplomat who had held high offices in the hierarchy. The mission set out on Easter Day, 1245, from Cologne, traversed Germany, crossed the Dnieper and the Don, and arrived 1 year later at the capital of Batu Khan and his golden horde in the Volga estuary, the town of Sarai Batu, alias Saxon, alias Ital. After his return to the West, Carpini wrote his celebrated Historica Mongolorum. It contains, amidst a wealth of historical, ethnographical, and military data, also a list of the people living in the regions visited by him. In this list, enumerating the people of the northern Caucasus, he mentions, along with the Alans and Circassians, the Khazars observing the Jewish religion, end quote. It is, as already said, the last known mention of them before the curtain falls. But it took a long time until their memory was effaced. Genovese and Venetian merchants kept referring to the Crimea as Gazaria, and that name occurs in an Italian document as late as the 16th century. This was, however, by that time merely a geographical designation commemorating a vanished nation. Part 9. Yet even after their political power was broken, they left marks of Khazar Jewish influence in unexpected places and on a variety of people. Among them were the Seljuk, who may be regarded as the true founders of Muslim Turkey. Toward the end of the 10th century, this other offshoot of the Guz had moved southwards into the vicinity of Bokhara. From there, they were later to erupt into Byzantine Asia Minor and colonize it. They do not enter directly into our story, but they do so through a back door, as it were, for the great Seljuk dynasty seems to have been intimately linked with the Khazars. This Khazar connection is reported by Bar Hebraicus, 1226 through 86, one of the greatest among Syriac writers and scholars. As the name indicates, he was of Jewish origin, but converted to Christianity and ordained a bishop at the age of 20. Bar Hebraeus, it's Hebraeus, not Hebraicus, I'm sorry. Bar Hebraeus relates that Seljuk's father, Tukak, was commander in the army of the Khazar Kagan, and that after his death, Seljuk himself, founder of the dynasty, was brought up at the Kagan's court. But he was an impetuous youth and took liberties with the Kagan, to which the Khatun, the queen, objected. As a result, Seljuk had to leave or was banned from the court. Another contemporary source, Ibn al-Adam's History of Aleppo, also speaks of Seljuk's father, quote, as one of the notables of the Khazar Turks, end quote. While a third, Ibn Hazl, reports that Seljuk, quote, struck the king of the Khazars with his sword and beat him with the mace which he had in his hand, end quote. We also remember the strong ambivalent attitude of the Gus towards the Khazars in Ibn Fadlan's travelogue. Thus, there seems to have been an intimate relationship between the Khazars and the founders of the Seljuk dynasty, followed by a break. This was probably due to the Seljuks' conversion to Islam, while the other Gus tribes, such as the Kumans, remained pagans. Nevertheless, the Khazar Judaic influence prevailed for some time, even after the break. Among the four sons of Seljuk, one was given the exclusively Jewish name of Israel, and one grandson was called David. Dunlop, usually a very cautious author, remarks, in view of what has already been said, the suggestion is that these names are due to the religious influence among the leading families of the Gus of the dominant Khazars. The quote house of worship, end quote, among the Gus mentioned by Katswini might well have been a synagogue. Might, we really don't know. We may add here, according to Artamonov, specifically Jewish names also occurred among other Gus branch, the Kumans. The sons of the Kuman prince Kobiak were also called Isaac and Daniel. Part 10. Where the historian's resources give out, legend and folklore provide useful hints. The primary Russian chronicle was compiled by monks. It is saturated with religious thought and long biblical excursions, but parallel with the ecclesiastical writings on which it is based. The Kiev period also produced a secular literature, the so-called Bylina, heroic epics of folk songs mostly concerned with deeds of great warriors and semi-legendary princes. The, quote, lay of Eager's host, end quote, already mentioned about that leader's defeat by the Kumans, is the best known among them. The Bylina were transmitted by oral tradition. According to Verdansky, quote, were still chanted by peasants in remote villages of northern Russia in the beginning of the 20th century, end quote. In striking contrast to the Russian chronicle, these epics do not mention by name the Khazars or their country. Instead, they speak of the, quote, country of the Jews, the Zemla Jidovskaya, and of its inhabitants as, quote, Jewish heroes, end quote, Jidovin Bogatyr, who ruled the steppes and fought the armies of the Russian princes. One such hero, the epics tell us, was a giant Jew who came, quote, from Zemlya Jidovskaya to the steppes of the Setsar under Mount Soroshin, and only the bravery of Vladimir's general Ilya Muromets saved Vladimir's army from the Jews, end quote. There are several versions of this tale, and the search for the whereabouts of Setsar and Mount Soroshin provided historians with another lively game. But, as Polyak has pointed out, quote, the point to retain is that the eyes of the Russian people, the neighboring Khazaria in its final period, was simply, quote, the Jewish state, and its army was an army of Jews, end quote. This popular Russian view differs considerably from the tendency among Arab chroniclers to emphasize the importance of the Muslim mercenaries and the Khazar forces and the number of mosques in Itil, forgetting to count the synagogues. The legends which circulated among Western Jews in the Middle Ages provide a curious parallel to the Russian Bylina. To quote Polyak again, quote, the popular Jewish legend does not remember a Khazar kingdom, but a kingdom of the Red Jews, end quote. And Barron comments, Red. The Jews of other lands were flattered by the existence of an independent Jewish state. Popular imagination found here a particularly fertile field, just as the biblically minded Slavonic epics speak of the, quote, Jews rather than the Khazars. So did Western Jews long after spin romantic tales around those, quote, Red Jews, end quote. So styled perhaps because of the slight Mongolian pigmentation of many Khazars. See, shit's already just being fucking, waters are being muddied and shit's being made up. You see? You see? Okay, section 11. Another bit of semi-legendary, semi-historical folklore connected with the Khazar survived into modern times, and so fascinated Benjamin Disraeli that he used it as a material for a historical romance, The Wondrous Tale of Alroy. In the 12th century, there arose in Khazaria a Messianic movement, a rudimentary attempt at a Jewish crusade aimed at the conquest of Palestine by force of arms. See, they done been plotting this shit since the 1300s. All right. Come on, y'all. So they've been plotting to get Palestine, which was never theirs in the first place. It's this fake history that they've had to come up with and keep pushing. Anyways. Okay. Aimed at the conquest of Palestine by force of arms. The initiator of the movement was a Khazar Jew, one Solomon ben Duji, or Ruhi, or Roy, aided by his son Menachem and a Palestinian scribe. They wrote letters to all Jews near and far in all the lands around them. They said that the time had come in which God would gather Israel, his people from all lands, to Jerusalem, the holy city, and that Solomon ben Duji was Elijah and his son the Messiah, end quote. The main sources for this movement are a report by the Jewish traveler Benjamin of Toledo, a hostile account by the Arab writer Yahya al-Maghribi, and two Hebrew manuscripts found in the Cairo Genitza. They add up to a confusing mosaic. I have followed Barron's careful interpretation. So, they're already like interpreting the Torah. They're already, because in the book of Joshua it says that they were finally delivered into their promised land, even though it was only like Joshua and Caleb that made it, because literally everyone else was unalived or died in the wilderness of starvation or thirst or whatever. So, you know, that happened already. Okay. This whole Jews to the promised land thing literally happened fairly early on also in the Old Testament. So, like, what are we even talking about here? Okay. These appeals were apparently addressed to the Jewish communities in the Middle East and seemed to have had little effect, for the next episode takes place only about 20 years later, when the young Menahem assumed the name David al-Roy and the title of Messiah. Though the movement originated in Khazaria, its center soon shifted to Kurdistan. Here David assembled a substantial armed force, possibly of local Jews, reinforced by Khazars, and succeeded in taking possession of the strategic fortress of Ahmadi, northeast of Mosul. From here, he may have hoped to lead his army to Edessa and fight his way through Syria into the Holy Land. The whole enterprise may have been a little less quixotic than it seems now, in view of the constant feuds between the various Muslim armies and the gradual disintegration of Crusader strongholds. Besides, some local Muslim commanders might have welcomed the prospect of a Jewish crusade against the Christian Crusaders. Among the Jews of the Middle East, David certainly aroused fervent messianic hopes. One of his messengers came to Baghdad, and probably with excessive zeal, instructed its Jewish citizens to assemble on a certain night on their flat roofs, whence they would be flown on clouds to the Messiah's camp. A goodly number of Jews spent that night on their roofs awaiting the miraculous flight. But the rabbinical hierarchy in Baghdad, fearing reprisals by the authorities, took a hostile attitude to the pseudo-Messiah and threatened him with a ban. Not surprisingly, David al-Roy was assassinated, apparently in his sleep, allegedly by his own father-in-law, with whom some interested party had bribed to do the deed. His memory was venerated, and when Benjamin of Tudela traveled through Persia 20 years after the event, quote, they still spoke lovingly of their leader, end quote. But the cult did not stop there. According to one theory, the six-pointed, quote, shield of David, end quote, which is actually the Star of Remphan, which adorns the modern Israeli flag, started to become a national symbol with David al-Roy's crusade. Quote, ever since, end quote, writes Barron, quote, it has been suggested the six-cornered, quote, shield of David, end quote, theretofore mainly a decorative motif or a magical emblem, because that's what it is. It's a sigil, began its career toward becoming the chief national religious symbol of Judaism, long used interchangeably with the pentagram or the seal of Solomon. Magic? Anybody? It was attributed to David in mystic and ethical German writings from the 13th century on and appeared on the Jewish flag in Prague in 1527, end quote. Barron appends a qualifying note to this passage, pointing out that the connection between Al Roy and the six-pointed star, quote, still awaits further elucidation and proof, end quote. However that may be, we can certainly agree with Barron's dictum, which concludes his chapter on Khazaria. During half the millennium of its existence and its aftermath in the Eastern European communities, this noteworthy experiment in Jewish statecraft doubtless exerted a greater influence on Jewish history than we are as yet able to envisage. Yeah, no shit. And this is a freaking perfect part to stop, because that ends the first part of the book. Okay. Now we're going to go to the part 2 of the book, which is the heritage. Okay. And I'm obviously not going to go here because I've got some running around. I got to go to the pharmacy and do a couple of other things. But I just want to thank everybody for sticking with me. Thank you guys so much. I love you guys. All truth matters. All truth matters. All truth matters. Okay. And the ultimate truth is Jesus. Okay. He died for you so that you could live a victorious life. And we are to love our neighbor and lay down our lives for others and love others the way that Christ loved us. I love you guys. I hope someone, at least one person, is getting something out of these readings. If not, they are still going to be here for posterity's sake and just for general educational purposes and T-ways. Anyways, I love you guys. I'm out.